Hey everybody, it's Mark Pattison. I'm back again with another great episode of Finding Your Summit, all about people overcoming adversity and finding their way. Before we get there, let's jump to my website, www.markpattisonnfl.com. I've got 275 plus episodes of podcasts with really inspirational people doing amazing things. Anytime you go to Apple, love the ratings and review. It helps elevate the show's popularity. We all need to be inspired, especially me. Number two, continue to raise money for Higher Ground, an extension with Amelia's Everest. My daughter has epilepsy, so helping others is what it's all about, paying it forward. And so anybody goes to that link, it goes directly to Higher Ground, and that's where the funds go to help others. And finally, you can see the Emmy award-winning Best Picture film, Searching for the Summit, the NFL did, on that particular link, and it will take you to NFL 360, and you can watch the 30-minute doc of me going up and down Mount Everest. And speaking of Mount Everest, I want to bring on my rock star guest today. His name is Adrian Ballinger. Adrian, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so just as I was saying a minute ago, and I'll say it again, I've been more or less stalking you around the globe for many years. It goes back to some shows that you've been on. You've been pretty visible. You're good at what you do. And for that, I've got mad respect on the way you've gone about it. And that is being the CEO of Alpenglow Expeditions. You've guided 100, I'm sure it's over 200, but a boatload of expeditions all over the world with a lot of people like me who are aspiring mountaineers that want to learn the game and go places that take a lot of grit and determination. You've done that multiple times. To get to that point, like we'll lead up to all these crazy expeditions and projects you've done, but like, where did that love of the mountains come? I know that you're up in the Squaw Valley region, Paradise, I think is what they call it now, something like that. But what brought you originally where you're that backcountry ski guy, you're that mountain climber guy, you're that rock guy that just has that love to get out in nature?
Yeah, it's a great place to start. Now, I think it's not a super traditional story. I didn't have an outdoorsy family or anything like that. I actually was born in England. My family is from England. And we moved to the United States, to Massachusetts, when I was 6 years old. My dad was on a 2-year contract with IBM at the time. This in the 80s. And we moved to the US, and I think my family was just like, well, people in America, they go camping and they go fishing and they go hunting and they go outside. So we started going outside, but we didn't have a clue. I remember, unbelievably miserable nights in little triangular pup tents, trying to cook hot dogs on a fire in the rain and definitely not doing things the right way. At the same time, I loved all sports, but I was a relatively mediocre athlete in the sports I played, things like basketball, soccer, tennis, and I would pour heart and soul into these different sports, but I never, and I played through high school and things like that, but I never found my place. At the same time, I started rock climbing and mountaineering through a family friend of mine, really diving in more deeply at about 12 years of age. And that's when I finally these two things clicked. It's an athletic pursuit. It's an athletic pursuit that, at least in my way of practicing it, had a huge component of suffering to be successful. And for whatever reason, my work ethic and mindset and what my family had taught me worked, that I started to have success in this pursuit of big mountains, climbing them, skiing them, rock, ice, kind of all the disciplines. And I just fell in love. And so, ended up going to school at Georgetown in DC. I was meant to be a doctor. That was my family's path for me. I, kept going. I did go to school. I did graduate, but at the same time, every free moment I had, I was outside climbing and skiing and trying to cobble together money to go places. And as soon as I graduated, I said I was taking a year off before going to med school. And that was 25 years ago.
Yeah, well, it's funny that you say this. Number one, you said you're from England. I just had Kitten Cool on the pod last week, and I'm sure you know him.
I did. He's a good friend.
He's a good dude, man. I really enjoyed it. And we were together at base camp on Everest with Garrett, who I climbed with, and he had kind of attached his wagon onto Garrett's machine, and so we had a few chats, but then we got had a really engaging conversation last week. So that was a lot of fun. Number two, you said Yeah. Number two, you said you moved to Massachusetts and then you went to school in Georgetown, which of course is DC. And there's not a whole lot of rock climbing that I'm aware of. A lot of mountains, down there. I guess you can go
The
north,
place to
right?
go for school.
Yeah. So I was expecting your answer to be Colorado or even my home state of Washington up there in Seattle with Rainier and things like that I'm sure you've climbed. So, okay. So you have this love of climbing. When I grew up, it was really, I was athletically, born with some skills more in football in particular. And what's really helped me life after football, because you go off a cliff and it's one of these sports where you can just continue to do, as long as you want to do it. I mean, it's really a choice as long as you can physically get up and down a mountain that you can put yourself through that. And what I've really enjoyed is the pain and suffering, which you just talked about in climbing, and the satisfaction with overcoming those certain things that I had in the NFL and in college football, that I have found the same thing on these big mountains. Every single one's been a challenge in its own different ways, and sometimes you have it and sometimes you don't. But at least it provides the process of going through the daily working out for a particular goal and planning it, putting it all together, and hopefully you can actually achieve those while meeting cool guys like you, along the way. And everybody brings a little something different to the table. Let's transition now over to, you started, well, I guess we should really transition over to when you're now, you're loving climbing and hiking on the weekends and this and that and ice and rock. But now there's a 25 years ago is maybe the time frame when you decided to actually make this into a business. Like this was going to be your career. What was that like, and where was your first expedition?
Yeah, well, as you could probably imagine, the path now looking back seems so clear, right? At the time, it certainly didn't feel that way. But yeah, so while going to school, I ended up with a mentor. His name was Chris Warner, and he owned the Earth Treks climbing gyms and used to also have an outdoor, Chris?
I know Chris. He's been on the pod. He's a great dude.
No, I would love to listen to that. So Chris was overseeing an outdoor education leadership program at Georgetown in between his expeditions. That's how he was funding his expeditions before he built his gyms, before he did any of that. And so I was a freshman in college when I first went to South America with Chris to Ecuador and climbed Cotopaxi, Cayambe, and Chimborazo. And that's when I saw people working with Chris and Chris himself who were making a living. I mean, it wasn't a pretty living, but they were making a living by working in the mountains and by guiding. And so I was 17 years old. I was rowing crew. I was a good athlete. But then, there was really this piece where it was like, oh, like this is amazing. Like climbing these 20,000 foot peaks. It was the first time I felt not only, of course, physically challenged, mentally challenged through the decision-making of risk that you see up there on a team, and then the emotional side of dealing with this level of adversity and uncertainty and risk of failure. All those pieces kind of came together on that expedition. So again, that was very early, but essentially when I graduated from school and took that year off, I was like, Chris, can I work for you? I'll do anything. And so I basically became like the coffee boy for Chris Warner around the world. And so went as like an intern on the trips he was guiding and his personal trips, saw how the industry worked, saw what mountain guides do, saw the power of the experience with clients that could be had in the big mountains, these teams that form and do really difficult things with uncertain outcomes. I just loved that feeling and experience. And so that really started my guiding career. I obviously didn't go back to medical school, let that go, and started growing as a mountain guide while also trying to climb and ski for myself.
Yeah, no, that's a great story. And that's the way you do it. You don't go from Little League football to the NFL. There's this progression, and it's the same way that I've done in the mountain climbing. Really, I took this on growing up in the Washington area and climbing Rainier and other mountains like that around dime a dozen. But really, where you start taking the next leap up and attacking the 7 summits and doing it in a chronological order. Most people don't go to Everest #1 because they don't have the skill set, to do that. Okay, so you've been on 8,000, a bunch of them, 20 plus times, these 8,000 meter peaks, which is something roughly over 24,000 feet. There's only so many of them around the world. Everest is the tallest, K2, you've been on both of these. For some reason, I'm thinking that your past, when you've gone to Everest, you've been going from the north side, which is the Tibet side, controlled by China, versus the side that I went on 2 years ago, which is through Nepal. Is that right?
Yeah, more or less. That's certainly right today. So I've spent 13 years guiding and climbing on Everest since 2008. My first 7 years, from 2008 to 2014, were on the south side, on the Nepal side. So I've actually summited 6 times on the south side. Really loved that side of the mountain and had a lot of my most formative experiences there. By 2014, I made the decision that the south side of Everest, the ice fall had become too dangerous for my calculation. This is, challenging because I have a lot of respect for some of the guys that run on that side of the mountain. But my calculation was it was no way, if you were an expedition operator on the south side of the mountain running teams and you were going to do, let's say I'm going to do this for 20 years, there's no way I couldn't have fatalities on my teams of mountain workers. That might be mountain guides or Sherpa or porters. Or clients, but I'm a little actually truly less concerned when I look at my business of the clients. I feel like you as a client on a team can take a look at the risk, recognize it, and make a decision. I'm willing to take that risk as an individual. But the mountain workers, the Sherpa and the mountain guides and the porters, they have to do this work financially. And I believe that leaves us as the expedition operators to make decisions around worker safety. Just like OSHA would help us to do in the United States, there is no OSHA in Nepal. So doing that calculation, and I think it's played out over the last 10 years, there's no way companies don't have fatalities guiding the south side of the mountain. And I felt like I couldn't ethically hold on to that as an expedition leader. And so I moved my operation to the north side in 2015. So since 2015, I've now been on the north side, the Tibetan Chinese side of the mountain. That has been a terrible decision financially and from a business perspective, but it is absolutely a decision I stand behind and believe in for my company.
So you're saying it's been a tough decision financially because my guess is that China decides to open or shut down Tibet on a whim's notice. So you could be all ready to go. So that'd probably be one guess of mine, and the other guess would just be because a lot of people like me want to experience that Kumai ice fall and what that is like, and going through Nepal, and not have that risk of China shutting down, really the gateway. But it seems like it would be super fascinating to go into Tibet. I mean, who goes to Tibet besides you?
Yeah, I mean, it's this incredible side of the mountain. I mean, interestingly, in terms of the history of the mountain, right? Like in the 1920s, the early expeditions were all on the Chinese Tibetan side of the mountain. And so it's got a lot of history to it. It's a beautiful route. It's a dramatically safer route for workers. There's very little ice fall, rock fall, crevasse hazard, avalanche hazard, because you climb a ridge the entire time. So anything that falls away from the route. Whereas on the south side, the Nepali side, you're basically in a valley the whole time. So everything that falls on top of the route. And so, it's a side of the mountain that I love, but it has this large challenge, just like you mentioned, which is the uncertainty of what the Chinese government will decide to do with Tibet and Everest each year. Will they open? Will they not? We often don't find it out until weeks before. So anyone who chooses to climb on that side takes a risk that their expedition could be canceled. And when you're putting a lot of time and money and effort into training for this big experience, that it is a smaller subset of climbers who are willing to take that risk. And the last 3 years have been a great example of that, right? Like, so, the Nepal side of the mountain was only closed in 2020 for COVID and was open in 21 and 22. The Chinese side of the mountain remains closed to foreign climbers this spring, 4 years later. And while I, have some respect for some of the decision-making the Chinese make in terms of safety on their side of the mountain, and part of that has been maintaining this closure, it's certainly painful. And I now have a group of climbers who have been waiting since 2020 to climb the mountain, and still haven't gotten to get there.
Yeah,
So,
I got to tell you my perspective really quickly, and I'm going to ask you a question. When I summited, I was one of the last guys to summit on May 23rd, 2021, right? And when I got up there, as you know, it's pretty pointy, right?
Yeah.
It looks like a teepee of a tent, right, at the summit. And the Chinese had it painted or I can't remember what it was, but like a red stripe, like do
for
not
COVID.
Enter. For
Right.
COVID, you cannot enter, right? So all the flags and all those things were on the Nepal
On one side.
Yeah, which was really interesting. In 2012, I want to ask you your experience with this. So you were on this show, which was a great show, by the way, Everest Beyond the Limits with Russell Bryce. And I can't remember, were you as a guide on that experience, or what was your role with that?
Yeah, so essentially, Russell and I started working together in 2007 on 8,000 meter peaks. I would bring American clients through my company, Alpenglow Expeditions, but I worked under the infrastructure of Himalayan Experience. Russell was the great grandfather of Himalayan guiding, 8,000 meter peak guiding. And so when I started, I'd been running Alpenglow, my company, for a number of years, had a lot of clients that wanted to go to 8,000 meter peaks, but I didn't want to pretend that I just knew how to do that. I found the single best mentor in the game, which was Russell Bryce. So we worked together from 2007 to 2012. And Russell was the overall expedition leader, but didn't leave base camp. And then I was like the climbing leader on the mountain, because I was this young, fired up, super, climber that loved working with the Sherpa. And so I would run things above base camp, and Russ would run things from base camp.
Yeah, it was interesting because I'm spacing on his name right now, but the biker that was kind of the rebel of the group, you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, Tim Medvets.
Yeah, Tim. I know Tim, and I was introduced to him by Duff McKagan, who's the bass player, the founder of Guns N' Roses. And so he wanted to connect me for the climbing reasons of the world, but it really illustrated, and I'm not sure how much that he really played that up in terms of being the bad boy and I do what I want, but you just can't, in mountain climbing, it's just like, even though it's an individual sport, when you get on these big boy mountains like that, just like my football days, it has to be teamwork. You have to be in coordination, and you have to have a leader, and it has to be a vertically integrated group. Otherwise, you run into major problems. And he just seemed like he kept creating all kinds of havoc around that.
100%. And Tim's a friend. I wasn't on the initial Discovery Channel show in 2008 that Tim was on, but I met him after that. And we ended up sharing a couple of mountains together in like the 2010s. And I still, get to hang out with him when I go to LA and things like that. And I would say Tim absolutely does understand and is actually an incredible team member, but also has this very, fun side story that I think gets played up. But I think also the mountain, kind of what we were speaking about, I think the mountains have taught him a lot of that. So those are early seasons on Everest with the Everest Beyond the Limit show in like 2007, 2008 that I wasn't on. I'm not sure he was the same team player that he is today, and through his organization that he put together, the Heroes Project. And I believe mountains have a lot of capacity to change us if we let them.
I love that, and I think you're right too. And again, I have nothing negative. It's just watching the show, getting to know him, and then watching the show and seeing the way he was portrayed on that particular mountain. I want to ask you too about this. I've seen you on TV a couple of different times, and you were part of this Eddie Bauer project in 2019 to go up and see if Mallory and Irvin had actually been the first guys to climb the mountain. I think it was 1924, right? And so it was televised around that. And what came first of all? What side were you going up? I don't know what side that was. And then number two is, at the end of the day, what was your discovery?
Yeah, so it was a Discovery Channel TV show looking for the camera, essentially, that Mallory and Irvine might have had. So Mallory's body was found by Conrad Anker and a team, I think in the late 90s, early 2000s. And he didn't have a camera on him. So ever since, people have been looking for Irvine's body, hoping he might have the camera on him. And if the film could be developed, maybe we could see if there's a summit photo to see if they were actually the first to summit in 1924, like you said. And so I was one of the members, one of the searchers on the team. It was a wild expedition for me because we actually ended up spending 8 nights living above 8,000 meters. So in what we call the death zone, above 26,000 feet. You know how difficult life is up there. We did have supplemental oxygen, but 8 nights living and searching over 2 rotations was the longest I've ever spent up there. I feel like I learned so much. I suffered so hard. In the end, we found many bodies. That's a sad reality of Everest, some that had never been found before, because we weren't just climbing on the normal route. We were setting up anchors and then rappelling down into nooks and crannies where a body might be found. So we found a number, and that's a sobering reality of the mountain. We never found Irvine. We never found anything. So what did I learn? I think Irvine's body might be gone. This was a very extensive search that built on decades of previous searches. I think he might have fallen to the glacier, and therefore the body, has sort of been moved by the glacier and probably destroyed. I don't think we're going to find him, and I don't think we'll ever solve the mystery of whether they were first. And I think that's kind of a special thing. I don't think we need to take away the first from Tenzing Norgay and Hillary, but I think what this team did 30 years earlier in the 20s, whether they topped out or not, it'll always be a great mystery. It was so far before their time, ahead of their time in mountaineering. I think it's really compelling.
It is. And, for those of people, I mean, you and I are kind of whacked out because we go do those things, right? but most people aren't, that would be listening to this pod. And the thing that is really interesting when you go back to 1924 and some of these, even 1953, I mean, you got guys going up there in tweed suits, right?
Yep.
And it's just like, this is basically impossible. I mean, after, I've got the full one-piece thing, and I've got all the equipment and the minus 40-degree bags and all that stuff. And they're in these canvas tents and these other things that you would just, not in a million years, if somebody said, go do this, you do it. I mean, it's just so risky. And yet they took that on.
And that age of exploration where that level of risk was completely accepted and even encouraged for like these grand things. It must have been an amazing time. I think we're still in a discovery phase today. But the discoveries we're making in mountaineering, they're more nuanced, right? They're like, can we push our bodies faster? Can we put one expedition after another back to back to make things more difficult? Can we find slightly different variations of routes that are more difficult? So there is still exploration happening, but it is so different than that era. And then to your point, like, with the weather forecast, I think the 2 biggest things that have changed in mountaineering are weather forecasting and communications. And those 2 things now allow us that it's almost unethical to get caught in a storm high on a big mountain now, because we have such good technology around us to be able to descend to a safe spot on the mountain. Whereas back then, there was just absolutely nothing. Of course, you were going to get stuck in a storm for weeks at 25,000 feet, and some people on your team were not going to survive. It's so wild to consider the sport in that way.
Yeah, and just side note, when I made it up on the south side, when I made it up to Camp 3, as you know, you've been up there 23.5. I was stuck in a cyclone for 3 days, and as you know, that is no place you want to be stuck.
No place you want to be stuck.
No, it was awful.
Even with the best gear in the world.
Yeah,
it's a testament. Obviously, you and the team you were with were strong enough to withstand that, right? Like when I think about weather, I'm often thinking like, at whatever that I want to get the most people to the top that I can safely, let's say. And there are a group of people that might be able to withstand a 3-day cyclone and then continue to the summit. There are others where that's going to go past our level of tolerance, right? And those are the decisions that we as expedition operators have to constantly make.
Yeah, we started 24 and 10 of us made it. So there you go. On that. Okay, I want to switch mountains for a minute, and again, you've been all over the Himalaya, and you're a rock star when it comes to climbing these different places. I've always been fascinated, although I don't want to climb this mountain, which with K2, and I know you did it without any of those. And so tell me about that experience for you, because, when I'm talking to Ed Viesters and other guys like that have done it, even Garrett, it's just one of the things that it's described as the steepness, which is nonstop from beginning to end. And with that comes rockfall and all kinds of other elements that really make that mountain a very dangerous mountain.
Yes. Where to begin? I mean, K2 is so important to me and to my personal journey. So kind of like you mentioned, I sort of have two sides to my career now. So I spend a lot of time as a mountain guide and running alpenglow expeditions to help others to achieve, summiting mountains that they dream of. But then I also am fortunate enough to have sponsors and be able to do personal expeditions, climb and ski things that I'm really passionate about. And K2 really fell in that category. I have a very conservative mindset with alpenglow expeditions and guiding. It's why I don't guide the south side of Mount Everest. I also don't guide K2. I've been asked for decades. It's another one of those in the column. It would be good for the financial health of alpenglow expeditions. But I don't think, for me, my risk tolerance, like the kind of like uncontrollable risks or hazards of K2, like you mentioned, the rockfall, the icefall, the avalanches, are too great for me to be able to feel like I can consistently guide the mountain year after year and not have fatalities. So I don't guide it, but I have kind of this long history of the mountain. I mean, obviously I've spent 13 seasons on Mount Everest, the tallest mountain in the world. When I summited Mount Everest without supplemental oxygen in 2017, I was really proud of it. But I was also like, how much of that is just almost like knowing the playing field, right? I was in my home court. Like I knew every inch of that mountain in and out. So I kind of questioned, like, could I do the same thing on a mountain I didn't know as well? And K2 is the second tallest. It's obviously much more technical, has all these hazards we're talking about. And I have this history because I was invited on a team in 2008 to go to K2. Ultimately didn't go because I was already guiding Manaslu and Everest, and it would have meant 6 months away from family and my business and things like that. So I didn't go, and the person who invited me, Rolf, was killed in an avalanche under the bottleneck, along with I think 11 other climbers. And so at that point in 2008, I think it was, I was like, all right, that's not my mountain, and I focused on these other mountains and these other things. But it always was there as something I'd like to go and see for myself. So I decided to go in 2019 because I had a great team of Eddie Bauer teammates, people I really trusted, felt like I was at my peak kind of athletically and in my like risk management mindset. Had a really challenging expedition, but was fortunate enough to stand on top without supplemental oxygen along with my teammate, Carla Perez. And we climbed something called the Cheston route, not the normal route on the mountain. The normal route's the Abruzzi route. We climbed a slightly more difficult route, but a route that I felt had less hazard, less random hazard, more hazard from your climbing ability, less hazard from rockfall and icefall. And so we climbed the Cheston route, and I mean, it will always stand as a peak I'm so proud of, but I can also tell you I definitely will not go back. For the listeners who don't know, as well as how steep the mountain is, it's got something called the bottleneck. Basically, 800 foot tall by hanging ice band that is constantly dropping pieces of ice off of it since it's overhanging. Those ice chunks can be anywhere from basketball size to small Tahoe cabin size, and they are funneled straight through something called essentially the bottleneck. Imagine a tight gully where everything that falls has to come down, and all the routes on the mountain meet and go through that gully. So at 26,000 feet, on oxygen for somewhere around 1.5 or 2 hours, or without oxygen for somewhere like 5 or 6 hours, you are in this gully underneath the bottleneck Serac. And if something falls, there's absolutely no way to avoid it or survive. So you are purely playing Russian roulette. The more times you go through it, the more likely you are to get the bullet. And those 6 hours under that ice fall for me were pretty intense. I don't have a couple of sentences to wrap it up, but I definitely questioned I'd made the right decision being there. I feel so fortunate to get through it. I will never go through it again.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame you, and that's mainly the reason why that that has not been one of those mountains for me that I feel like I need to go do. Like you said, you've used this word several times about the risk tolerance, and that's just not a risk tolerant mountain that I feel like where I'm at in my life I need to go do. So okay, skiing summits. Makalu, I think that was the one. Hillary Nelson had been on this pod a year ago, and she passed away when she skied. I believe she'd come around, she'd summited, and now she's starting her way down on skis. What is that like for you going down? Because so many of these summits, when you get up into them, it's not usually like it's a bluebird. Well, it might be a bluebird day, but the ice conditions in the mountain, it's just you're going down on a sheet of ice. And to me, right. I live in Sun Valley, and I'm in backcountry all the time, and so I know it well. And I just, when it gets down to -10 and these other, super cold, and it turns into that sheet of ice, I just don't like to be on it because, again, risk tolerance of just breaking something. I'm not worried about falling to my death on those mountains, but for you, where does that love come of when you decide to climb a mountain? You're going to either climb it or ski it.
Yeah. So going all the way back to the beginning, when I moved to Massachusetts as a 6-year-old, skiing was my sport. Like, if you had asked me as a 6 to 18-year-old, you could be an Olympic athlete in any sport that you play. And like I said, I did all of them. Skiing would have been the one. It was the one I poured heart and soul into. I could walk to this little ski hill called Mount Wachusett, 800 feet of vertical, but I had night skiing. So if I finished my homework, my parents would let me walk to Mount Wachusett and ski. So I'd finish my homework by 4 or 5 and go from 5 till 8 and ski and skip dinner. And that was my life for all those years. And I was never good enough to go pro as a skier in any of the sports. As you probably know, I started too late, right? The kids started age 2, and they're in Olympic training programs by, the time they're teenagers and things like that. But I loved it, and I had kids who were going to the Olympics and things like that I skied with, Junior Olympics, and so a lot of great people around me. So I became a good skier, but never good enough to go pro. But so skiing was still always my personal passion all through college and those early climbing years. And when I was working with Chris Warner, skiing was where I was putting all my personal energy while climbing and guiding. And eventually in 2011, the two finally kind of came together, where I had a private client, a Russian former World Cup downhill skier, who wanted to climb and ski big mountains, and started hiring me on a private basis. And we started going around the world skiing big mountains. And he was an unbelievable skier, but not a climber, right? So I kind of brought in the climbing side. We started skiing these peaks together. So in 2011, we made the first ski descent of Manaslu, the 8th tallest mountain of the world. And that's the mountain that Hillary died on last year. And we also made attempts on Makalu, the 5th tallest mountain in the world. We tried to ski Everest, we tried to ski Lhotse, we were all over. So really, it's just been this thing where I finally was able to combine my skills at high altitude and the amount of time I spend at high altitude on big mountains with my passion for skiing. And eventually I became a pretty confident, good skier with sponsors and things like that. Yeah. And those are really the personal expeditions I chase after. There is a lot of hazard, of course, and you've heard my risk tolerance, and I back off of a lot more big 8,000 meter peaks that I try to ski than that I succeed on. Makalu, for instance, the mountain I skied this spring and made the first ski descent of, the 5th tallest mountain in the world, I had tried twice before and backed off of because of hazard before finally it coming together this spring.
Crazy. So we are in the beginning of 2023. And again, you are the CEO, the founder of Alpenglow Expeditions, take people all over the world if that's what they want to do. You've been on a lot of them. What does 2023 look like for you right now? What are you trying to continue to challenge yourself and things like that? How do you continue to evolve?
So glad you asked that question. I don't know if you know what my answer is going to be.
I don't know that. This is a blind question, dude.
Well, 11 weeks ago, my son Arrow was born. So I have an
Congratulations.
11-week-old with
Oh,
Emily
wow.
Harrington, my wife.
Yeah.
And so right now my challenge and it feels like an expedition. I don't know if you have kids.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm on an expedition of like not sleeping enough, being exhausted, still needing to try to make good decisions, dealing with epic long periods of boredom, punctuated by like moments of sheer terror. This is my expedition. That's not to say Alpenglow got so many fun things planned. I'm still planning on going to some mountains this year, but my heart and soul right now is in this kid.
Yeah, I get it. Everything you just described reminds me of that crazy storm I was in at Camp 3 on Everest. But I do have, I'm on the other side of the fence. I've got two girls, 24 and 26. And so, you just stick your baby's head out the door, a little water and sunshine, and they'll grow pretty quick and you'll blink.
Totally.
Yeah, no, congrats though on that. It's a wonderful experience and journey.
Thank you.
Yep. So where can people find you?
Yeah, so the best way to find me, well, first of all, we've mentioned it, but Alpenglow Expeditions is my guide company. We're lucky enough, we take over 6,000 people a year out now climbing and skiing, much of that in California. Loads of that is introductory level for people who have never tried before. And we go all the way through to the 7 summits, guiding Everest, and also a lot of mountains that maybe people haven't heard of before, but mountains that we as guides and climbers or skiers are passionate about. So Alpenglow Expeditions on Instagram or on the website. And then I personally am at Adrian Ballinger on all the social networks.
I love it. Hey, listen, I've like I said in the very beginning, I've been chasing you around now for a couple of years and following your progress and what you've been doing, and always like to connect with a fellow mountaineer and guys that have a zest for life, and you certainly fall into that bucket. So appreciate coming on and look forward to running this podcast.
Well, thanks so much. Congratulations on all you've accomplished, and look forward to seeing the next mountain that you find yourself on.
All right. Well, there he is, the one, the only Adrian Ballinger. Thank you so much.